The Battle of Troy, History in 30 Minutes. Chapter 1, The Apple of Discord. Long before the clash of bronze on bronze outside the high walls of Troy, before 1,000 ships blackened the Aegean, and before heroes carved their names into the bedrock of legend, there was a feast. It was a celebration of divine love, the wedding of Peleus, a mortal king, and Thetis, a sea deity of dazzling beauty. The gods gathered on Mount Pelion to honor the union, and the feast was rich with ambrosia and wine. Zeus, king of gods, presided. Hera, his queen, looked on with regal approval. Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, offered calm blessings. Aphrodite, mistress of love, smiled with veiled amusement. But one goddess had not been invited. Eris, the goddess of strife. She came anyway, unseen in a veil of shadow. In her hand, she carried a golden apple, inscribed with 3 words that would birth a war. To the fairest. She tossed it among the gathering with a laugh like cracking ice and vanished into the wind. The apple rolled across the marble floor, glittering in the torchlight, until it was claimed by Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. Each laid claim to the title. Each demanded judgment. No god dared decide. Even Zeus, wise to the mischief of women and war, refused. Let a mortal choose, he decreed. Let Paris of Troy decide. Paris was a prince, but not a typical one. Raised among shepherds after a prophecy warned he would be the ruin of Troy, he lived on Mount Ida, tending flocks and playing the lyre, handsome, thoughtful, and fated. Hermes, messenger of the gods, descended in a shimmer of light. Come, Paris, he said, the goddesses await your judgment. On a quiet glade, the 3 goddesses appeared in a flash of divine light. Hera, stern and majestic, promised him dominion over all Asia if he chose her. Athena, with eyes like storm clouds, offered wisdom and victory in battle. Aphrodite, radiant and soft, leaned close and whispered, "Choose me, and I will give you the most beautiful woman in the world." Paris's heart quickened. His mind was no match for his longing. He gave the apple to Aphrodite, and thus the die was cast. The most beautiful woman in the world was Helen, queen of Sparta, wife to Menelaus. When Paris arrived in Sparta, he was welcomed with the hospitality sacred to the Greeks. But desire knows no law, and Helen, swayed by Aphrodite or her own longing, fled with him to Troy. When Menelaus returned and found her gone, he howled like a wounded lion. He went to his brother Agamemnon, high king of Mycenae. The oath once sworn by Helen's suitors, to protect her chosen husband, was invoked. Ships were readied, armies summoned. 1,000 sails bloomed like storm clouds across the Aegean Sea. And so, over a stolen queen and a golden apple, the world moved toward war. The gods smiled. The mortals sharpened their spears. The fate of Troy was sealed, though none yet knew how long or bitter the road would be. Chapter 2, Paris and the Prize. Troy stood proud along the shores of Asia Minor, her walls tall and unbroken, a jewel of commerce and power, guarded by the sons of King Priam. Behind those ramparts lived a people of wealth and valor, but also of fate. For within those walls now walked Helen, daughter of Zeus, queen of Sparta, now queen of Troy, though no rights had crowned her so. When Paris returned with Helen, the city was divided. Priam, gray-bearded and wise, welcomed her with the grace of a king who feared the wrath of gods. Hecuba, his queen, looked at the foreign beauty with unease, and Cassandra, cursed with prophecy none believed, cried out warnings to stone ears. "She brings ruin," the prophetess wailed. "Troy will burn for her." But Paris, drunk on love and glory, paid no heed. Helen, silent and luminous, walked the palace like a dream. Some said she came willingly, others whispered of enchantment. Either way, she was there, and Sparta had been shamed. Meanwhile, across the wine-dark sea, Menelaus gathered his allies. From Mycenae came Agamemnon, iron-willed and ambitious. From Ithaca came Odysseus, clever and unwilling, but bound by oath. From Pylos came Nestor, old in years and wise in counsel. From Phthia came Achilles, son of Thetis, a youth of unmatched strength, fated to either short glory or long obscurity. They came in droves, kings and warriors, driven by honor, rage, and the promises of plunder. The call of Helen was the call to war. But before the fleet could sail, the winds turned hostile. At Aulis, the Greek armada was stranded, waves still as stone. The seer Calchas read the omens and shivered. The goddess Artemis is angry, he said. Blood must be paid, a royal blood. Agamemnon, whose pride had once offended the huntress goddess, was told to offer his daughter Iphigenia. He raged, he wept, he hesitated, but ambition burned deeper than grief, and so he summoned his daughter under false pretenses, promising her marriage to Achilles. She came in white robes, smiling. She did not return. The winds rose, the sails filled. The Greek fleet left Aulis behind. 1,000 ships stretched like a blade across the horizon. Toward Troy, toward destiny, toward a war the world would never forget. Chapter 3, Oaths and Armies. The winds that had once resisted the Greeks now drove them hard toward Asia Minor. White sails cracked in the wind as black hulls sliced the sea. The sun rose behind them, casting long shadows before the prows. Warriors leaned over rails, their minds filled with visions of glory or of home. When they reached Troy, the beach became a forest of ships. Spears glinted, shields clattered, bronze feet struck sand. A wall of tents rose almost overnight, and smoke coiled into the sky from 1,000 campfires. The siege had begun, but Troy did not fall in a day, nor in a year. The city's walls were tall, its gates mighty, and its warriors proud. Hector, son of Priam, led the defense. A prince of unparalleled valor, he bore the hopes of the city on his shoulders. With his brother Paris at his side, less a warrior, more a symbol, the Trojans manned their towers and stood firm. The Greeks, though mighty, were not united. Kings quarreled, pride flared. Agamemnon ruled by fear and title, not love. Achilles, the brightest flame among them, burned with his own pride and fury. Odysseus urged strategy, Nestor offered wisdom, but egos strained every alliance. Raids were made on nearby towns. Supplies were pillaged, captives taken. One such prize, a maiden named Chryseis, was given to Agamemnon. Her father, a priest of Apollo, begged for her return. When Agamemnon refused, Apollo sent a plague. Greek warriors fell, bodies piled like firewood. The camp groaned under divine wrath. At last Achilles spoke. Return the girl or watch your army rot. Agamemnon relented, but demanded Briseis, Achilles' own prize, in return. Fury lit the hero's eyes. He rose, blade in hand, and would have struck Agamemnon down, but Athena stayed his hand. There will be a reckoning, Achilles growled. He withdrew from battle. He would fight no more for a king he despised. The Greeks lost heart. The Trojans gained ground. Without Achilles, the tide turned. And so, the war dragged on. 10 years of dust and blood, of spear thrusts and funeral pyres, of brave deeds sung in the dark. All because of oaths sworn, pride wounded, and a woman whose face launched 1,000 ships. Chapter 4, Troy awaits. Inside the mighty walls of Troy, time passed in the rhythm of war. Raids, sorties, feasts, funerals. The city did not sleep easily, but it endured. Fathers trained sons in the art of spear and shield. Women wove and waited. Priam ruled with a quiet sadness, a king bearing the weight of a prophecy. Hector walked the ramparts daily. To the people, he was strength incarnate. To his wife Andromache, he was husband and father, a man who kissed his infant son with the same hands that held a bloodied spear. If I fall, he told her one night, let our son grow brave, but let him know peace, not just war. Paris, meanwhile, lived in Helen's shadow. He trained, he fought, but the people murmured. He brought this upon us, they whispered. Even Helen, though she stood regal beside him, felt the weight of her beauty as a chain. Do you regret it? She asked Paris one evening, watching the fires of the Greek camp flicker along the shore. No, he said, but his voice faltered. On the battlefield, the Trojans struck boldly, pressing the advantage left by Achilles' absence. Aeneas, cousin to Hector, fought with quiet determination. Sarpedon, a prince and son of Zeus, led the Lycian allies with honor. The gods watched, some aiding, some hindering, for even Olympus was divided. Zeus, bound by fate, held back his hand. Hera schemed. Athena plotted. Apollo favored Troy, Poseidon favored the Greeks, and so divine wills clashed as often as mortal blades. One night, emboldened by success, the Trojans broke through the Greek wall and pushed toward the ships. Fires roared, panic spread. Ajax fought like a god. Diomedes struck like lightning. Odysseus rallied the men with cunning and courage. But without Achilles, their strength faltered. Then Patroclus, dearest companion to Achilles, took a desperate gamble. Clad in Achilles' armor, he led the Myrmidons into battle. The Greeks believed their champion had returned. The Trojans hesitated, but Hector, undeterred, met him in single combat. Blade rang on blade. Dust rose. Patroclus fell. The illusion shattered. When the news reached Achilles, his grief was not the quiet mourning of a man, it was a storm. He screamed. He wept. He covered himself in ash. And then he rose. "I will kill Hector," he said. "I will give him to the dogs." And Troy, watching from behind its walls, knew the storm had returned. Chapter 5, The Long Siege. The dawn after Patroclus' death was blood red. Achilles returned to the field of battle like a force of nature, his armor gleaming, his wrath terrible. The Myrmidons followed him, driven not by orders, but by the fury of their captain. No parley, no mercy, only vengeance. The earth seemed to tremble beneath his feet. He slaughtered Trojans like wheat beneath a scythe. Rivers ran crimson. No man could stand before him. Not even the gods wished to meet him in his fury. And then he found Hector. Before the gates of Troy, Hector stood alone, waiting. Honor bound him. He had slain Patroclus, thinking it Achilles. Now the true line had come. Their duel was long and savage, watched by both armies from behind shields and ramparts. Dust billowed. Blood spilled. In the end, Achilles drove his spear through Hector's neck. Troy screamed, but Achilles' rage had not cooled. He tied Hector's lifeless body to his chariot and dragged it through the dust, day after day, around Patroclus' funeral pyre. Even the gods turned their eyes away. At last, Priam, king and father, came alone into the Greek camp. Guided by Hermes, he knelt before Achilles and kissed the hand that had slain his son. "Remember your own father," Priam said. "Pity me. Give me back my child." Achilles, the demigod, wept. He saw in Priam the shadow of his own father, Peleus. He returned Hector's body, and for a brief moment, the war paused in mourning. But not for long. The siege dragged on. Troy still stood. The Greeks, wearied and weather-worn, plotted in council tents. Supplies dwindled, morale frayed. It was Odysseus who spoke what others dared not. "We will not win by strength. We must win by guile." Plans were whispered. Carpenters called. And in the shadow of dusk, hammers rang out as the Greeks began building something the world had never seen. A giant wooden horse. But that tale belongs to another chapter, and the final deception had yet to come. For now the long siege continued. Spears clashed, lives ended. Songs were sung in grief and valor. 10 years of blood, all for a single woman, and still the walls of Troy held. Chapter 6, Gods at War. The plains of Troy were soaked not only in mortal blood, but in divine ambition. The gods, once content to toy from afar, now descended into the fray. The sky darkened not with storm, but with divine quarrel. Olympus, that high and radiant seat, trembled with discord. It began with Hera and Athena, burning with rage that Paris had chosen Aphrodite. They had nursed their grudges like coals in a hearth, and now the fire spread. "Let Troy burn," Hera declared. "Let them feel the sharpness of Greek bronze," Athena agreed. They descended, cloaked in mist, to rally the Achaeans. Athena stood beside Diomedes and Ajax, lending them speed and cunning. Hera whispered into Agamemnon's dreams, urging blood and glory. The Greeks surged forward with newfound strength. But Apollo would not allow Troy to fall so easily. Golden and radiant, he defended Hector, shielded Aeneas, and struck terror into Greek hearts. His arrows felled men by the dozens, unseen and silent. Artemis, twin to Apollo, joined her brother, sending plague and panic. Poseidon, lord of the sea, took the Greek side, if only to spite his nephew Apollo. He rose from the waves like a titan, and the oceans heaved. He called upon the power of the storm and struck fear into the hearts of Troy. Even Ares, god of war, could not resist the pull of battle. He rode beside Hector in a chariot of flame, his spear thirsty. Athena met him on the field, and the gods clashed as men did, with roars and thunder and broken earth. Zeus watched from his throne, his face grim. He had promised Thetis that Achilles would be honored, but he also knew the fate of Troy, and fate once spoken, even he could not undo. He sent Iris, swift-footed messenger, to restrain the gods. "Let fate take its course," he said. "Let mortals fight their war." But the gods, ever proud, did not wholly listen. Disguised as men, cloaked as dreams, they continued their meddling. The war was not just one of swords and shields. It was one of wills, divine and human, locked in endless contest. One night, as stars pierced the dark sky, Thetis rose from the sea and came to her son. "Your time comes soon," she said to Achilles. "Glory or life, you must choose." Achilles, knowing death would follow Hector's, nodded. "Let it come," he said, "so long as my name endures." And the gods, watching from sky and sea, knew the climax neared. The chessboard was nearly full. The final gambit, cunning, divine, and cruel, would soon be played. Chapter 7, The Rage of Achilles. The death of Hector had not ended Achilles' fury. It had only transformed it. No longer the firestorm of grief, it became a colder, deeper wrath. He fought each day not for glory or vengeance, but because it was the only language he had left. The Myrmidons followed him like shadows, their bronze spears dark with blood. None who faced them survived. Even the mightiest warriors of Troy fell or fled. Achilles was death incarnate, and the battlefield his domain. Yet even Achilles, forged of divine and mortal blood, was not beyond fate. Paris, the once scorned prince, had not been idle. With the aid of Apollo, he took up his bow. The god guided the arrow as it flew, and it found the one weakness in Achilles' armor: his heel, where Thetis had held him as an infant when she dipped him in the Styx. Achilles fell. The earth itself seemed to shudder. The greatest of the Greeks was gone. His body was recovered by Ajax and Odysseus, borne back to the ships with reverence and grief. A great funeral was held, a pyre that lit the night sky. His ashes were mixed with Patroclus's, as he had wished. Mourning gripped the Greek camp. Even Agamemnon stood silent. Even Menelaus, driven by his need to reclaim Helen, wept. But war does not wait for tears. The armor of Achilles, crafted by Hephaestus himself, was now without a bearer. A contest was held to decide who would inherit it. Ajax, mighty and honorable, believed it his by right, but Odysseus, clever and eloquent, won the prize. Shamed and broken, Ajax took his own life. The Greeks were diminished, but not defeated. The prophecy remained. Troy could not fall until certain conditions were met. They needed the bow of Heracles, and they needed Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles. Odysseus set out to retrieve both. Meanwhile in Troy, Helen stood on the battlements and watched the horizon. Her beauty had not faded, but her eyes were shadowed by guilt and memory. "I am the reason for this," she whispered to the wind, and still it goes on. Paris, though now a hero for felling Achilles, knew the gods had guided his hand. He was no fool. He too saw the end approaching. He sought the help of the deity Oenone, once his lover, a healer of the wild places. She refused him. Wounded by Philoctetes and abandoned by fate, Paris died alone, and Helen wept again, for the boy who had chosen her and the kingdom that would soon fall. The Greeks, with Heracles' bow and Achilles' son now in their ranks, prepared for the final act. The rage of Achilles had passed into legend, but its echo still shook the walls of Troy, and in that echo death rode ever closer. Chapter 8, Duel of Heroes. The dawn was quiet. It was the kind of silence that comes before the storm, unnatural, heavy with waiting. From the walls of Troy, sentinels watched the Greek camp with wary eyes. The Achaeans were no longer many. Years of war had thinned their numbers, but their resolve had hardened like the bronze they bore. Among them now strode a new warrior, Neoptolemus, son of Achilles. Young, fierce, and golden-haired, he carried his father's spirit in his blood and his armor on his back. The son had come to finish what the father began. Opposite him, behind Troy's battered gates, stood Aeneas. Cousin to Hector, leader now in Hector's place, Aeneas bore the hopes of a weary city. Brave and pious, he had survived every storm fate hurled his way. Their paths, fated long ago, would soon collide. The Greeks pressed once more against the defense of Troy. Philoctetes, with the bow of Heracles, rained death from afar. Neoptolemus cut a path through the outer walls. The Trojans, outnumbered and outmatched, fell back to the city's heart. It was then that Aeneas stepped forward and called for single combat. Neoptolemus met him in the ruined square before the Scaean gates. Their duel was not one of hatred, but of honor. Two heirs of legacy, fighting not for glory, but to end a war. Bronze rang on bronze. Shields cracked. Dust clouded the air. They were evenly matched. Neoptolemus with the fury of youth, Aeneas with the strength of endurance. For hours they fought, and the armies held their breath. But fate had chosen. With a final cry, Neoptolemus drove his spear through Aeneas's shield and into his shoulder. Aeneas fell, bleeding, not dead, but broken. He was spared. Odysseus stepped forward and called for terms. No more heroes must die. Let this end. The Trojans, battered and grieving, knew their time had run out. Priam, now aged beyond reckoning, stepped from the palace and offered a final plea. But the Greeks had one last move to make. The gods had not yet played their final hand. And so, while Aeneas was carried back to safety and Priam mourned another son's fall, the Greeks retreated to their ships, leaving behind a gift of wood and silence. The duel had ended. The city still stood, but night would bring its doom. Chapter 9, The Wooden Horse. Night fell upon Troy like a shroud. From the ramparts, the Trojans beheld an astonishing sight. The Greek ships were gone. All that remained was a massive wooden horse standing outside the gates, silent and towering. The beach lay deserted. Only wind and waves whispered on the shore. The city erupted with cautious hope. The war is over, some said. They've left at last. Priam came to the gates leaning on his staff. Others gathered around the horse, soldiers, elders, children. It was a marvel of craftsmanship, carved from the timbers of the ships. Upon its side was an inscription, a gift to Athena, for a safe voyage home. Only one voice dissented. Laocoon, priest of Apollo, stepped forth. "Beware Greeks bearing gifts," he cried. "This is no offering, it is a trick." To prove his warning, he hurled a spear into the horse's side. The weapon thudded into the wood, and from within came a muffled clang, as though bronze had struck bronze. Some froze, others ignored it. Then, as if to silence the warning, two serpents rose from the sea, slithering through the surf and onto the land. They coiled around Laocoon and his sons, crushing them in their grasp before vanishing back into the waves. "It is a sign," the people cried. "Laocoon was punished for blasphemy." And so, with songs and wine and reckless joy, they pulled the wooden horse through the gates. Flowers were thrown, drums were beaten, and as the city celebrated its victory, the horse stood watch in the square, still and waiting. That night, as Troy slept, a hidden hatch opened. Odysseus emerged first, followed by Neoptolemus, Menelaus, and a hand-picked group of warriors. They slid down ropes and dropped to the earth, blades drawn. They opened the gates. The Greek fleet had not gone far. Under cover of darkness, they had sailed back. Now, with the gates open, they poured into the city like a tide. Troy burned. Temples fell. Houses collapsed. Streets ran with blood. Priam was cut down at the altar of Zeus. Cassandra was dragged from the temple of Athena. Hecuba screamed into the smoke. And Helen stood on the palace steps as Menelaus found her. Sword in hand, he looked upon the woman who had caused 1,000 ships to sail and 10 years of slaughter. But he could not kill her. Beauty, fate, love, whatever it was, stayed his hand. By dawn, Troy was ash. And so ended a city once favored by the gods, undone by pride, passion, and deception. Only a handful survived. Among them was Aeneas, guided by the gods, carrying his father on his back and holding his son's hand. He would wander long, and one day his descendants would build another empire. But Troy was gone. Its walls crumbled, its towers fallen, and in the silence after the fire, only ghosts remained. Chapter 10, Ashes and Aftermath. The fire had consumed more than stone and timber. It had devoured dreams, bloodlines, and God's favor. Troy, proud and ancient, now lay in ruin. Smoke hung in the morning sky like morning veils, and ash blew through the streets like snow. Among the rubble wandered the broken, those few who survived. Hecuba, once queen, now wept beside the corpse of Priam. Cassandra, mad with foresight and grief, was dragged away in chains. Andromache was torn from the ruins of her home, her son wrenched from her arms. Menelaus took Helen aboard his ship, his face cold, unreadable. Some say he forgave her, others claim he could never truly look her in the eye again. But he spared her life, and that, in the end, was the final irony. The Greeks had won. But what had they gained? Most would not see home again. Odysseus would wander for years. Agamemnon would return only to find death waiting in his own palace. The gods had used them all as pawns. Troy had fallen, but the price was beyond reckoning. In the smoldering wreckage, Aeneas slipped away. Guided by the gods, burdened with destiny, he fled the city with a small band of followers, his aged father Anchises on his back, his son Ascanius at his side. They carried with them the last embers of Troy. He would journey across sea in sorrow, through trials and loss, until he reached the shores of Italy. There, his line would begin anew, and from it, the Romans would rise. In that distant future, the spirit of Troy would live again, not in stone, but in story. The gods turned their gaze elsewhere. Olympus was quiet. The game was over. And on the blackened plains outside the ruined city, the wind whispered through bones and broken spears. So ended the war that gods had kindled, that mortals had fought, and that poets would sing of for all time. Troy was gone, but the legend had just begun.